Good morning. This morning we'll be talking about automation strategies to overcome the workforce and financial gaps. Before we get started, I'd like to go ahead and let the panelists do themselves justice and introduce themselves. So,
Hi.
Tim?
Yep, I'm Tim Hill. I work for Centrify in product management and strategy. Prior to coming to work for Centrify, I worked at Anthem in security. Of course, I was there during the breach, and prior to that with FIA, the student loan industry, and Technical Electronics, for those of you that know who T Connectivity is.
Hello, my name is John Kopczynski, and I'm a director over at KPMG and help manage their federal cybersecurity practice.
My name is Trish Cagliostro. I'm the head of public sector sales engineering for Anomaly.
So by 2021, it is estimated we'll have a 350,000 person shortfall in the United States and 3.5 million shortfall of cyber professionals in the workforce. So this is a growing problem that we know we have to face. Some attribute that to training, education, misalignment of the market, but I also say it's a misalignment of actually adoption of technologies. And so the first question, let me start with you, Tim, is describe some of the barriers federal agencies most regularly face when attempting to implement automation and orchestration across the enterprise.
Yeah, so, and one of the things I have a benefit of is I visit a lot of the Centrify customers who are in the midst of these transitions. And one of the things that I notice is that inside of our IT teams, that there seems to be a lack of understanding of what work really is, right? And I say that jokingly, but I actually mean it, is there are three types of work. There's the work we do every day, which we'll call support activities. That's typically a lot of IT people spend their time on. Then there's the change activity, and then there's the unplanned work, right? And if you understand those three activities and you know who your rock stars are in those areas, you should have already been able to identify the people who can tell you the work you do really well. And the work you do really well should be the work that you're planning to move towards automation. And those pieces of work you do really well, along with those rock stars to help facilitate it, are going to be the people who can help you move to the next level. So part of these barriers are actually the leaders themselves not understanding the types of work they do, the types of workers they have, and how do they get to the next level. I have to tell you, I regularly hear people say they're going to forklift what they've got to the cloud. And I have an internal sigh when I hear that, because that's a very challenging process.
John, let me ask you, how much of this has to do with I don't want to lose my identity with what I control now with orchestrating across this enterprise?
So, some of the challenges that you have with respect to kind of backing up a little bit is that cyber is inherently it's tough because you've got as much disruption and commoditization happening at the same time. So you've got billets that you used to be able to put people in seats with, and hey, I'm going to put 20 people to be able to do this job with A&A. So for that matter, or authorization and accreditation. But now there is this move towards disruption. So there's all these tools out there that can help facilitate automation orchestration associated with some of these security roles that previously you had kind of butts and seats to kind of grind at. So I think that it's almost you need to be able to link kind of the strategic vision associated with the organization to kind of the tactical what's happening down on the ground to be able to say here's how we bring those two together.
Trish, how mature do you think the federal government is in orchestration across the enterprise?
So I would argue it widely varies. There are some organizations who are very mature, others that just aren't. And I think where that comes from is that for me, one of the big barriers to entry to orchestration is that despite the fact that we as security professionals, a lot of us come from engineering and technical backgrounds, we focus on a lot of the art as opposed to the science in our space. And I think that there's organizations, my background's in Department of Defense, and I think they've done a phenomenal job with saying, you must document processes. There's a lot of art here, we get that, but you have to define your processes because you can't automate if they're not defined. And so from the federal government perspective, I think there are organizations like the Department of Defense who have really made a concerted effort around documenting those processes, around making sure that while there might be some art, it's a small subset and not all of it. And then it becomes trainable, repeatable, and ultimately can be automated.
Back to John's point, though, how do we, as an ecosystem, let's stick with the federal government, where they're not used to procuring the tools and the people at the same time. And so we buy services from one organization, we buy a tool from another, and it may not click together. Does anybody have an opinion on that?
So we actually need to connect those two groups together, right? So this is, Dr. Tibbetts was up here and said, this is business process, right? So, I think some people would cringe when I say process trumps technology every time, but it does, right? So if you really understand your business process, you're going to bring those architects and those leaders from different groups together, and you're going to define the objective, define both the near-term and long-term goals, and say, okay, here's what we need to accomplish. What tools and techniques do we need? HR, here's the skills we need. So how do we build that model of short-term, long-term goals, contract out for some things, and hire in and then buy.
Okay. So given the lack of maturity, how do we as industry help the federal government move in that direction?
Well, so that's good. We're selling products, right? Right. So I think a lot of that has to do with our ability to articulate how technology can be deployed to help them both address their on-prem and their goals of moving to the clouds, and where the hybrid models actually come in place that leverage their local skills.
John, you do assessments on this all the time. How do we expedite that?
Two things. So I think that it's incredibly important to make sure that from any kind of IT transformation or legacy uplift is that the business is involved. By and large, I've seen too many engagements where the IT part of the shop is just moving so quickly that they fail to kind of effectively and efficiently engage the business. Also, for that matter, please don't forget security. Security is incredibly important, especially if you're looking from a CMMI level perspective. So from a defect, it is much more efficient and effective to be able to capture those defects within the planning and requirement stage versus when you get over into into production. I've seen some studies that say that it's almost a 200-to-1 cost associated with finding a security defect when something's already in production.
Trish, we talked about earlier forklifting an entire process or an entire system and throwing into the cloud, and that happens every day. How do we help agencies with true transformation?
Sure, and I think I have a little bit of a different perspective on this because we're a product company, and I think that what tends to happen is that if you don't have automation today on your network, moving to the cloud will not solve that. It might reduce your infrastructure costs, there might be other benefits, but it's not going to just magically create automation and orchestration capabilities. And so when we think about kind of that question of when we're talking about this from the orchestration perspective, the technology should ultimately be the glue that's going to sit between all these technologies, or that's going to sit between your other technologies on your network. We've made tremendous IT investments, we've made tremendous security investments. When we talk about transformation and ultimately getting to those higher level, larger goals, we can't get hung up in, and this is where I think government comes into play, we can't get hung up in the boiling the ocean idea. There are infinite opportunities for automation and orchestration, and we really have to break it down and think it as a step-by-step process, a phased approach. From our perspective, one of the things that we do is that it's a very easy conversation to have with government organizations especially, to be able to detect things more quickly. Detect is great, help me detect more quickly, integrate threat intelligence from a detection perspective, that's an easy conversation. Blocking is a much harder conversation. Automatically blocking is scary, and that's kind of that example of that's the longer term, the forklift type approach. And so when we walk it back, one of the things that we do is first we work with our customers to establish trust, and let's start with that detection. There's a much lower barrier to entry, there's much lower of a cultural issue with it. And so when we start there, it ultimately helps us get them to that proactive position, which is where they want to be. But if they start there, they can often get hung up in politics and some of the challenges there of articulating why it matters.
Yeah. So Sean, one of the things that we try to focus on is talking to them first about that adoption of automation and orchestration and what it would look like. Here's how quickly you could deploy, you know, your next system and get it ready for the application teams. And then ask them, why won't this work? What does this introduce to your process that it won't work? And that actually gets them to rethink their strategy about migration versus, you know, refactoring, starting fresh, addressing old problems.
No, I agree. John, what about you?
Yeah, I love transformation projects, and from a security perspective, because it gives you an opportunity not just to make sure that you have the most current technology out there, but also gives you an opportunity to be able to take a look at your data. I mean, by and large, I've seen a number of systems through which there are, you know, inaccurate data, and so as you're using these systems to be able to have decision support, you need to be able to rely on that data. So also use this as an opportunity to be able to look at your processes, look at segregation of duties, so making sure that you don't have any conflicts there. So there are some things. It doesn't necessarily need to be kind of a very kind of clean cut or clear cut, you know, transformation. You can do kind of a number of complementary projects in tandem.
So a theme that I think we've heard a couple times already this morning is process. We already know we're going to have a people shortfall. The process. How much, when we talk to our partners, do we see process just being skipped over and jumping straight to the technology?
So it's we like blinky lights, right? Mm-hmm. So yeah, we'd like to jump right in and start building things and show how great it's going to be. Business process absolutely has to be addressed, but at the same time, there has to be a consideration for business process transformation, right? So you have to lean your processes out because some of those are old traditional processes that don't have a place in the cloud. They don't have a place in rapid experimentation, right? You have to be willing to adjust those, not compromise, but be able to adjust those processes.
But I'll ask anybody to take this. I did time in the VA and EPA. It's hard to bring COTS systems into the federal government because they want to keep their process. And so you can bring the best of breed software product into the environment and they'd be like, well, let's start tweaking. And all of a sudden now it's a COTS product. John, you're laughing. Or Trish, do you want to grab it?
Yeah, so I think we have an interesting perspective on that because that is absolutely, we especially run into that in our space. We're a threat intelligence platform. And what we tend to see on the government side is the threat intelligence teams have been around a lot longer than on the commercial side. And so they have some level of capability. They have things that are kind of duct taped together, some scripts, you know, copying and pasting some manual processes that exist. And I think you hit the nail on the head. We run into that all the time where people want a COTS solution that is totally customizable, which are two kind of inherently competing ideas traditionally. And I think that's where orchestration and technology like ours come into play. A big focal point of ours is integration, and not just integration with your existing technologies, but being able to integrate with legacy systems, with all the different technologies that you use on your network. And I always tell my government customers to make sure that when they're talking to other vendors, that they make sure that they really understand the flexibility of the particular product that they're integrating. Because in a perfect world, we would all be integrating with COTS solutions that are all standard and look the same across any networks. If anybody knows any networks like that, please let me know. I'd love to talk to you. But they all look different. They're all customized. And so from our perspective, the integration approach, being able to integrate with all these different technologies and provide, it's kind of like the best of both worlds, where there's the flexibility to extend into specific government use cases, but at the same time maintain and have that supported by us. We pre-build all of our integrations for our customers, and that gives them a COTS integration solution, so it's not too custom. It's not too custom in the sense where when that guy moves on, you know, who wrote those custom scripts for you, ultimately there's a software binary that's managed by a vendor instead, so it's more maintainable, more sustainable long term.
Yeah, I agree, John.
Yeah, I think that one of the biggest challenges, you know, from a consultant perspective, is that when you talk to a client and they say, you know, we have this process because we've always done it this way. So you know, we've been doing this function the same way since the 90s, and there have been a lot of advancements since then. And to that point, if you're looking at a COTS solution to be able to provide some sort of orchestration or transformation within your network, we strongly encourage to try to keep as close to the vanilla build as possible, because ultimately, anytime that there is a there is an uplift on version of any kind of customization ultimately ends up breaking, and so then you're pulling in professional services to be able to fix that API or that JSON pool that used to work on version 5 but now doesn't work in version 6, and so ultimately that's costing more money. And if there's an opportunity to be able to keep or change the process to be able to fit the technology, as long as you're not impacting the business or the mission, then I would take a hard look at that.
Tim?
Yeah, so I'm going to go back to some of our personnel discussions, because I want to leave people with the thought that a number of the people in your organization are really the most critical people. And we sometimes call them our architects, but I want you to think about them as the people who aren't married to their processes. They are very open thinkers. They're willing to accept change, and they're willing to bring other people along with them on this journey. Those are the people that we need to help grow. We need to help flourish, because they're the ones that are out there thinking about transformation. Sometimes they're just not in the position where they can be influencers. So bring them to the table, help them grow, and listen to what they got to say, and get them together as frequently as you can. And I'm not talking just simply about IT type people. I'm talking about business leaders, HR people. Get them all together so that they could help transform your organization.
Yeah, I was going to pull on that a little bit more. I mean, who, as you start bringing technologies to the government or to the customer in general, is it HR, business? Who else? Who else do you believe needs to be at the table and having these conversations with?
I mean, HR, business, legal, anybody. I mean, sitting. Obviously the CISO. It all depends ultimately on the business process that you're trying to inform. And so, and what we also recommend is that we need to step away from looking at security from a system perspective and start looking at it from a business process perspective. So think like payroll for a second. Payroll isn't just kind of issuing of checks, and so payroll can include HR. It can include the process for time entry. It could include so all these requisite additional business processes that need to be able to be effective in order to be able to have that employee at the end of the day to be able to receive that check. It's going to be important to pull that to the table.
Yeah, and I think this was said a little bit earlier that process trumps technology, and I have a little bit of a different view on that. I think that technology should enable process, and they should be developed together. And if you have the wrong technology mapping to the wrong process, you're going to have a problem. If you have the wrong process mapping to the wrong technology, same thing. And so as we're talking about pulling in the right people into the room, I used to work in the Department of Defense HBSS program, and one of the things that I used to do when I went on site with organizations, and was a little bit different than the rest of my team, was I didn't just talk to the security administration team. I would kick off my process over the course of the week with a meeting that would have a designated person from the support team. So when we deployed something to our test group and it might have caused an issue for an end user, we had a process and a point of contact who had an immediate escalation path to us to get it resolved. The next thing that I did was I pulled in the IT service people, kind of the enterprise services, things like email, people from that team, to make sure that we had connections into them, that if God forbid something happened with an enterprise level service, there was an immediate escalation path. And there were some other groups as well, but I think too often we make these security decisions in a vacuum. And what ends up happening is there's ultimately impact to operations, which then makes anything we want to do in the future harder. And it creates roadblocks for orchestration and for automation, because the second you cause an unexpected impact, impact is going to happen. Whenever you deploy a major technology, whenever you are getting into some of these transformational activities, there's always going to be impact. The difference is when it's unexpected and unplanned, and there's no method, and there doesn't appear to be to the organization a way to quickly solve it. And I think that's part of it's not just the people that should be in the room, but why they need to be in the room is that when you have that risk management approach of being able to resolve any impacts that come up and manage those expectations, then all of a sudden it's a much easier conversation for orchestration and automation.
No, I agree. Before we go to the audience, I'll ask this question. Part of this is education. Part of this is an awareness by our customers that we're trying to do this. A lot of them are under political constraints to get things done today and maybe not the right way. How can we expedite this? How can we boil the frog quicker? If you've never heard boil the frog, just real quick, throw a frog in a boiling pot of hot water, they'll jump out. Throw them in a warm water, they'll fall asleep, boil them, you boil the frog. That's the only way to. So how do we expedite this?
So I think it's important, you know, Trish was right on the right path here, is you got to get the right business people and business process owners into these discussions, not along with your IT, because what you're going to find is they're going to help you develop a priority approach, right? So with a priority approach, you're going to be able to say, which technologies, which skills do we need, and where do we start? Sometimes the IT people are going to start in the middle rather than at the ends where they need to start.
Okay, John?
I block and tackle. I'm a big fan of Agile. So make iterative and meaningful deployments, and so to be able to so that that senior leader can show to their bosses, hey, we're making movement. So this whole big bang approach, you know, can work in some cases, but by and large, the most successful projects that I've seen have been iterative, because again, requirements change over the course of the timeline of the project, and that gives you the ability to be able to pivot and move.
So from my perspective, it's working jointly with government and us as industry to identify quick wins. The more that you can quickly build wins, and the more wins you start to pile on top of it, you'll ultimately get to some of those longer term goals. If you have a big initial failure up front where there's severe impact operations, that will ultimately that will set your automation orchestration planning back a significant amount of time. But if we can work together to jointly build those quick wins, and they start to pile up, all of a sudden you're really far along, and that usually takes a lot less time.
Great.